So what we're going to do is walk you through quickly the update that we're proposing to our long-range facilities plan. So I want to start by telling you that we actually philosophically believe that the environment that we educate our students in matters. So we have high standards and high hopes for the type of facilities that we want. We're cognizant of the fact that every time we build new buildings, the gap between new buildings and older buildings feels larger, so we also want to keep up our old buildings. So this video is an attempt to communicate our philosophy about the importance of our facilities.
Poudre School District, leading the state and nation with a tradition of excellence. And now, we're actively planning for the future. So what does that look like? Students learning in first-class facilities. Through building improvements and new construction, our students gain opportunities to pursue their passions. With thriving partnerships, we find strength through community. As we grow and change, community support is essential to student success. We strive for excellence every day. With a solid foundation rooted in tradition and community, we're laying the groundwork for continued success. Poudre School District, building our future together.
So the district has a comprehensive long-range facilities plan. That document is extensive and is usually updated every 7 to 10 years. The last time it was updated is in 2007. So the process we are going through now is the next update, which is less than 10 years, but that's because of growth. We're seeing growth in the southeast side of the district and the northeast side of the district. We're here down in the southeast side. You can feel the growth and the impact it has on our schools. And up on the northeast side of the district, we're feeling the same pressure with growth. So we have a group of experts that started meeting in last July of 2014. They're made up of people from the city, people from our staff, some people from the construction industry, and we hire a professional demographer who does this for a living and does the best they can to help us with projections. So it's all based on the best data that we have available. We are very closely in touch with all of the construction that's going on or that's being planned to happen inside our district boundaries, and that's an ongoing project to stay up to date with all of that. So we take demographic projections, we take census data, we take birth rates, observable trends, where growth is happening in which neighborhoods, our current student population, so we take our current kindergartners and say, what's the 6th grade class going to look like when this group grows up? And we look at the differences in the enrollments in different regions of the district and what's happening in all of the different areas. But I will tell you that our best educated expert guesses are still our best guess, because this is not a exact science. If you think about it, in 5 years, the kindergarten class is not born yet. So you can't project too far out into the future, and you're really looking at a crystal ball. So these are the best numbers that we can come up with, and we're pretty confident that they are good guesses. So the final, we have planned for a year of talking to the community. So this is our last session for this school year of going out into communities, but during the summer and the fall, we'll be reaching out to all of our service organizations, chamber, all the other types of groups that we have that are organized groups of people in the community to share this plan with whoever pretty much wants to listen. And then in the fall, in the next school year, we will be coming back around to school communities. So it's not the last time you will hear from us. And then in the spring, in March of 2016, the final plan with any revisions or changes will be presented to the board. So the board will not approve this plan until March of 2016. So in other words, if you think of a great question after tonight, you still have plenty of time to tell us about it. So we have as we look at this plan, we have 2 major areas of concern. One is our aging buildings, and the other is how do we handle the growth that we're seeing in student population. This is a chart of population forecasts for Larimer County, keeping in mind that we do not cover all of Larimer County, but the growth that's happening in the county we certainly feel in the district as well. And when you think about county population projections, that includes all kinds of people, not just children. So we work hard at figuring out what we think the student numbers and the childhood numbers will be out of that total population growth. So our best projection just not too long ago were these numbers. In 2015, that we would have 28,500 students, topping out at 30,500 in 2019. And last October, we exceeded the 2015 number already by 500 students. So if you think about that, if all of those students were in one place, that would be an entire school, easily, particularly in elementary. They're not. They're spread out all over the place, but we do have parts of the district that are getting quite crowded. So I want to stress that we're looking at new construction, additions, some boundary modifications, and school closures are not a part of this plan. So at this point in time, we are not proposing any school closures. So if you look at our existing facilities, we have asked all of our principals to meet with their school accountability committees before this school year was over. That conversation, I'm sure, will be ongoing to talk about what are your needs and desires in your current building. So we're collecting all that information from the occupants of the building to say, what are your priorities? We also have a facilities department that has a facilities audit of all of our buildings, and they have a different list of what their priorities for the buildings are. And as we move toward finalizing the plan, we'll be looking at how do we combine those two lists or merge them together to come up with a list for each school. We are forming up and they've met once so far, a Community Facilities Advisory Committee. Len is here, and so is Rob. Those two people in the audience are already participating on that committee. They are made of community members, and they are here to listen and particularly to weigh in as it relates to how do we merge those two lists together for the aging buildings, and how do we come up with the final list of what we're proposing to do or not to do. It's a matter of prioritizing, but it's also a matter of the size of the cost of the final plan. How much money is this going to cost, and what has to drop off the list simply because the cost is just getting too high. So all of those factors will be taken into consideration, and this community group is committed to helping us sort through that. So in the immediate need for growth, we're seeing modulars being placed at buildings. You're familiar with modulars. A modular, in our mind, is 2 classrooms, approximately 50 students. So 25 each side is an average number to use. So if you see one modular outside a building, think 50 students. We're also talking about school choice. I know that's been an issue here at Fossil. We have not changed anything about our school choice policy. It lines up with state law. State law is that we do have choice. Another piece of state law, however, is that under no circumstances can you have a policy that allows someone into a seat that bumps out a neighborhood student, someone who's in the boundary. So someone who lives in the boundary of a school is first priority always. And so our policy follows that. What we're finding in all of the schools is that as growth has been happening and the schools are getting more and more crowded, we have students who choiced in before the crowding got as bad. And our philosophy at all levels, kindergarten, middle, and high, is if at all possible to let students finish at the school they started. So as we're having less and less seats available, you're seeing it more and more at the entry level, the grade level, whether it's kindergarten, 6th grade, or 9th grade, is where there's less and less seats as we let the other kids age through and leave the same building if at all possible. We're also looking at the capacity of each building and trying to maximize in the buildings that are impacted how many neighborhood kids can fit in there. So for example, if we have a district program that it's appropriate to move that program to another building that's less crowded, we're in the process of looking at that and moving some programs. And then we also have a space modification, which I'll talk about in a minute, that happens to be at this building. And then in the midterm, we're looking at new construction and additions and some targeted boundary changes. So these are the schools that either have modulars or will be continuing to get more modulars over the next couple years. And you'll see Fossil is on that list. And then for having less and less seats available for choice, this is the list of schools that are very highly impacted. And our assistant superintendents are working very closely with the principals in these schools to make sure that we're carefully following the choice policy. I don't remember if we mentioned before we started about the website where all of this information is being held. Kim can tell us about that in a minute. But on that website, we've made a point of putting that choice policy up. It's very frequently requested, and it's kind of hard to dig around in our policies to find it. So it's in the long-range planning part of our website so that you can find it easily if you're interested. So at Riffenburg Elementary School, we're having to move early childhood out of Riffenburg. In the past, Riffenburg was very low enrollment. We had space, and we moved some early childhood classrooms in there. That's the preschool program. We no longer have room for early childhood, so one by one, we've been moving those early childhood classrooms out so they can have regular K-5 classrooms in there. Wellington Middle School is looking at a lot of growth and looking at significant modulars. And then Fossil, we're looking at, we're changing some of the science labs from dry to wet, which means we're plumbing them, because by plumbing them, we're able to offer different kinds of courses. It gives us much more flexibility to handle more students. So you'll see that work is being done this summer. So in terms of new construction, this is what we are proposing. A new elementary school in the far southeast corner of the district, all the way down south and east. So on the east side of I-25, south of Bethke, south and east, down in that bottom corner of the district. We're looking at a permanent addition to Zach. Zach is very crowded, but based on the numbers and the development that's happening and that has already happened within their neighborhood boundaries, we do not believe they need more than one wing, that the enrollment will top out and they'll be able to hold all of their neighborhood kids with the addition of a wing. Riffenburg, as I mentioned, we're moving early childhood out. The only boundary change that we're proposing in this plan that does not have to do with opening a new school is between Riffenburg and Laurel, and I'll talk to you in a minute about how those boundaries will be finalized. But we have a proposed boundary change to move some fairly small amount of the Riffenburg students over to Laurel that has more room to shift that boundary a little bit. The rest of the new boundaries that will be determined are all the new boundaries that will be drawn around new schools. Okay? We're looking at a new middle school, high school configuration east of I-25 on Prospect. The district owns a 100-acre site. We're planning to use that to build similarly to what happened here, where there was a middle school and a high school sharing the building until the high school finished filling up. In the meantime, building a middle school and moving the middle school out, which is what happened with Canard. Canard shared this building for 2 years. We're looking at that exact same scenario, not sure if it'll happen quickly in 2 years or not. Actually, we're kind of hoping it might take more like 3. But the same design, same idea. So that the building itself is designed to be a high school, but 2 schools share it. Just to clarify, we're not talking about a 6-12 educational program with 1 principal. We're talking about 2 separate schools, 2 principals sharing a facility. We are looking to do the same thing up in the Wellington area. We do not have the land specified for that at this time. The growth pattern that we're seeing and that we're projecting is slightly different for Wellington. We believe that Wellington Middle School as a site is very inadequate, and we know that the middle school is going to fill up very fast in this new building, and that over time there will clearly be a need for a high school up in that area, but we think it will take longer to get to the point where the high school is a full-sized high school. On the Prospect site, we're looking at a new athletics complex similar to Frenchfield. We have a lot of, if you think we're adding another high school and potentially 2 more high schools, we're going to have more pressure for play fields. And we already have pressure on our play fields at this point in time. So as part of building this complex of all different types of play fields, not just a football field, we are looking at synthetic turf for the main play fields and also synthetic turf at the other play fields. If you know anything about turf management, you know that if you play the field over and over, pretty soon you have dead grass. So part of having a live field is that you have to manage the grass and rest the grass, which means the field can't be in use. So we need a field that can be almost continuously in use, and so that's why we need to switch to turf, synthetic turf. So the new Southeast Elementary School would start construction in 2016 to open in 18. So it would accommodate new growth and relieve the pressure at Bethke, Bacon, and Timnath. We are still in the process of securing that land. We do not own it at the moment. So a proposal would be that it would open in the fall of 2018. The middle school, high school property up at Prospect would relieve pressure on Lesher, on Preston, and here at Fossil Ridge. So we're looking at extensive growth and new construction within the next 5 years to fill this school up. The complex, I think I already told you all of those things. Oh, we have had some questions about a pool. And no, we are not including a lap pool, a competitive lap pool in this plan. Not that we don't think some parts of our community need it, but it just doesn't, when you look at the extensive needs of our aging buildings and all of these new buildings, we think it's just not a high enough priority at this time. And it's expensive. And then other people have asked, what about Hughes? What about Hughes Stadium? It is not the kind of facility that we need. We do not need one field that seats 30,000 spectators. We need multiple fields, and the maximum spectators we need is about 6,000. So it's not at all what we're looking for. So this would be a timeline, a proposed timeline for each of the pieces of the growth plan. I will tell you that we do not have the funds to fund any of this. The way that Colorado funds construction capital projects is through local bonds. Some states fund school construction differently. In Colorado, the per pupil amount that we receive on an annual basis to run schools, it's based on how many students we have, is not designed to build buildings. It is designed to cover the operational ongoing costs, which is enough to cover transportation, the basic functions of a school district, but not the construction of new facilities. And Dave can talk to you in a moment about how bonds work and how that would work. So our proposal would be that in 2016 in the fall with the presidential election that we would ask our community for a bond to fund that. The financial plan for what all of this costs, we'll talk about also in a minute, would be available no later than this coming fall. So a year before the election, we would have a good sense of what we think that would cost and how big that bond would be. So as we grow, other needs grow as well. Our transportation facilities are already maxed out. All of the buses in the northeast side sit outside. We can't keep them undercover anymore. We would need more buses. As we have more schools, we need more buses and more busing facilities. Administrative needs and information technology, of course, would proportionately grow a bit. We are also considering, these are some of the questions we have not answered yet, and the long-range planning group is still meeting. One of the current ideas on the table is about some of our alternative programming. So we have some very interesting and popular alternative types of schools, and they are mostly all centrally located. So as you look at a smaller geographic district, if parents can reach some of these alternative programs more easily, it makes sense. But as we grow out into the two corners of the district, we're wondering if some of our specialty programs that are district-wide should have some satellite sites. So that's part of what we're thinking about. Also, the PrestonCanard question. It's very unique because Canard has no boundary and no neighborhood students, and Preston does. And they're both very close to each other. They share a lot of the same neighborhood kids, and they're both very crowded. And so that question is being taken up separately by the committee with a proposal yet to come as to how to handle that. Some people have said, draw a boundary around Canard. So all of the options that people are considering are being talked about at this point in time. Early childhood is a concern, as some of our kiddos are very needy, and we are required to provide preschool, and our parents that are in our preschool programs absolutely love them. We want more preschool, but at the same time we're actually concerned that we're having to move them away from the neighborhood schools where the families live, and we're making a better plan for early childhood. Our pattern has always been, and our philosophy has been, to have early childhood in the kindergarten, in the same building where the kids would go to kindergarten. And with some of these buildings being so packed out, it just isn't possible anymore. So we're thinking maybe in some regions of the district, our philosophy can remain that, and in others, maybe we need to have a more centralized program. So we're looking at those numbers. And then also we have our engineering study and information on every building as relates to heat. And so we have to look at the results of that study too and decide which parts, if any, of those changes to buildings will we also include in this bond. So we have lots of groups helping us. The Long Range Planning Group I mentioned, the Community Facilities Advisory Committee I mentioned, boundaries. So we have drawn boundaries where we think they make sense, but they are not finalized. And in the fall, the board will call up the Boundary Committee. It is made up of the principal and one or two people from every affected school that has skin in the game. And they will wrestle through the demographics, and it will be tedious, and they will bring me a proposal for where they think those boundaries should land. Keeping in mind that everything except the Laurel Riffenberg one at this point in time is where will the boundary for the new school be. So most kids, the vast majority of kids that would be affected by a boundary change will be ones that get to go to the new building, which parents usually like. So, and then the mill. Can we ask questions now? No, can you write one down and Kim will make sure we answer. The Mill Bond Committee is a committee that's a long-standing committee that has been meeting since the last mill bond was passed. It is all dedicated community members. There's several of them here tonight. They provide community oversight over the district's expenditure of past mills and bonds that the voters have voted for. So as we are transparent and show them all of our expenditures every year, they talk to us about whether they believe that meets the intent that the voters had when they passed it. So they will continue to meet. I'm expecting that most, if not all of them, will continue to meet going forward. Should the bond in 2016 pass, they'll continue their oversight responsibility on behalf of the community. So that's the presentation. I'll leave the timeline up there, and we'll let Kim lead us through a discussion.
Absolutely. So again, please do write down your questions on the index cards, piece of paper, send that forward, and we'll make sure to answer those here this evening. For those of you watching at home, you can write down your questions or send them through email to info@psdschools.org. And please do that. We will answer those throughout this evening as well. I just want to touch quickly on the website. There is a bunch of resources on psdschools.org. If you go to that homepage on the right-hand side, there's a link to the long-range facilities plan page. And that is where the choice policy lives. That is where all the information and question and answers from the previous forums live. A lot of information there that might be helpful. So again, right on that front page on the right-hand side, look for that link and you will find what you're looking for, we hope. Yes.
Can I also mention that on the website is the long version of the long-range plan? I don't believe that's out front, but it includes all of the maps. All of you can see the land that we own. Every boundary for a new school that's proposed is in there, so you can see all. If you really want to dig into details, it's in there. And if you don't see something you're looking for, email us at that email and we'll get back to you.
Absolutely. All right, so while you're writing your questions down, we did have a few come in earlier just for some clarification. Let's just get some context on Fossil. Currently, how many modulars are here on site?
Yeah, currently there are not any modulars on the Fossil site.
Okay, and in the plan, it says that they're planned for 2017. Is that one modular, or how many are we planning moving forward?
You know, at this time, we'll say one. I think it'll depend on as we watch growth and if we need to respond. Because a lot of times when we go to place modulars, we plan for two, because it's just as cost effective to wherever we locate to plan for two. And then if we bring in one, if we have a need for a second one, because of some unanticipated growth somewhere, we can be prepared at the same time.
And it sounds as though Fossil's pretty darn full right now. Do we have some capacity numbers for some sense? Outside of it just feels really, really full.
Yeah, right now it's right at 98 or 99% of its capacity.
Great.
So.
And with the new middle school, high school, how do we anticipate that impacting enrollment here at Fossil?
So, you know, like they said, the current boundary is just a study area. So if we were to take that current study area, we have about 575 or 600 high school students currently living east of I-25 in our proposed boundary, you know, to be determined at a later date from the boundary committee. But if we were to take the current numbers right now, there's about 475, so 476 high school students that currently live in the proposed new boundary that attend Fossil.
Okay.
So a fairly large chunk that would be phased in. They wouldn't obviously leave all at once, but that would be a phased-in process as the grades progress through.
And can you talk about just broad numbers about how much growth we're seeing over there?
So the east side of I-25, anyone who's driven over, you know, County Road 5 or, you know, through Timnath has seen a great deal. I'm tracking a little over 2,200 total single-family and multifamily housing units that are being proposed. So we're seeing a great deal of growth, mostly on the east side of I-25. There is also quite a bit of growth in infill, you know, Kechter and areas like this that also impact Fossil Ridge. So we are tracking those subdivisions as well. But you know, even right now with the 400 or 500 students that live east of I-25, there will be, by the time the new school gets built, there will be an additional couple hundred high school students that would be impacted. So those would be alleviating pressure by being taken out of Fossil, but those would be replaced by the students who are coming in places like Kechter and a very large elementary and middle school population wave that's coming through that will be in the high school in the next 4 to 6 years.
I'm going to stay on the Fossil theme if you'll let me. So do we know or have in front of us the exact number of students at Fossil for the 15-16 year?
Yeah, there's no way to determine exact numbers until the school actually opens up and they take the October count. Well, the capacity is 1964, but that, you know, there's a lot of there is some flexibility in that. We take into account, you know, class sizes, and when you're calculating the capacity, you're calculating a number of students per class, and you're also calculating how many classes you leave empty at any one given time. So while our calculated capacity is 1964, it's generally, depending on the calculation, about 85% of its total capacity. You can't fill every class every hour of every day. So you have to anticipate empty classes, and that's part of how the utilization number and the capacity number is calculated. So you have to leave a certain number of classes empty during every single period to account for the fact that you have migration between classes, as well as you need teacher work time, and so they're not teaching every single hour. So there is some flexibility in that, and class size also plays into the role of that. I think someone else would probably be able to speak a little bit more intelligently to that. I look at just sheer numbers. But yes, there is some flexibility. Just because you have 1,965 kids in a school that's 1964 doesn't mean you have one kid without a seat.
And I should add as well that remember that there's the aging out process that's happening as well in Fossil, as well as all of the impacted schools to one degree or another, and each one's a little bit different. So when we're looking at capacity, we're also looking at letting the kids who are in there finish even if it's pushing the number much higher than we would like, we're not opening new seats for choice kids.
So is Fossil the only school right now that is capped?
No,
No. There's others in the district that are facing that same
Absolutely.
challenge.
mostly down in this region.
Yeah. And so can you talk maybe a little bit more about that philosophy of capping and how that relates and fits in with the school of choice policy? And particularly, there's concerns that if we cap too stringently without enough flexibility, we might be losing good staff members as a result.
I know that has been a concern, and I have to say that that the decisions about staffing are not made centrally. So each building gets the same amount of money per kid and makes their choices about how they staff. And so we don't get involved in that. We do, because of this incredible growth that we have to deal with, we have more hands-on in terms of determining every year what that number should be, given how many kids you already have of choice in the building, and helping principals figure out what that number is. And after that, we step back. So the principal decides with their community how to staff the buildings.
Will those modulars increase that 19, I can't remember the number, will that increase your cap number?
Yes.
It will, okay. Okay,
And let me just say that modulars, our philosophy about modulars is not to build modular cities around every building because it's a popular school, so let's just add 20 modulars and let them have as many people as they want. There are people who would like us to do that. And that's an interesting question because you can have more programs, you can have a little bit more of everything the more kids you have. But the fact is that we build each school to be a certain size, and if we don't permanently add additions and infrastructure to a building to increase the intentional size, it's not our intention to meet the needs of all of the programming that everybody would ever want by having modular cities out there. We just believe what's happening is the community's growing, we need to redraw boundaries over time and build another school where all this growth is happening as a long-term plan.
so can you talk to us about the timing of the funding? So, and maybe we might even have to back up, but I think ultimately where I want to get to is if we are funded per student, when is that determined in the school year process? And then how then do principals have that budget to work with to figure out their staffing and resources and how they'd like to allocate those dollars?
Sure.
So before Dave starts, I want to give him some kudos because this year he led us through a process that makes it much easier on principals to know sooner what their number is, especially if they're shrinking in any way, which is not the case here.
Does the district also have contingency funds in that budget? I know that each school does, the principals do, but does the
Yeah.
district have a contingency fund also?
Okay,
That's
I'm going to hold that question. Let me write that one down. So I want to go timing, and then we'll talk about funds, and then maybe we'll talk big picture financing after that.
Yeah, sure. So let me talk about probably the school level piece first. So within Poudre School District, what we use what's called a weighted formula, and the weighted formula basically determines the amount of resource that's flowing out to the site. Now, I will say it's not the only source of resource. There's much other items that come into the building, but the primary one is student-based budgeting, and it primarily allocates funds out based on student character or student head count, but it also takes into account student need also. So it looks at things like at-risk and gifted and talented items like that. So basically, the timing of that is we develop projections for the coming school year in January. Those are finalized in February. And then we produce our budgeted numbers out to our sites, typically the week before spring break in March. And so they have the budgeted amounts based on their projected counts available, and then they work with their school accountability committees to determine how they're going to use that resource within their building. And then it comes back to the central office, and then we incorporate that into the budget.
The average
Yeah,
rate that you
sure.
started.
So there's a couple of modifications. We've reviewed student-based budgeting the last couple of years. There's one modification I think that's relevant to this conversation tonight, and that is introducing a conversation or a concept of averaging. And in the past, what we would do is, again, we have the projected count, schools work with that, but then when the October count is finalized, the coming fall, what we were doing is we were doing what we call a true-up, where we basically renormed the budget based on what the actual students were in that report. That was problematic because we were seeing a number of characteristics within the district that we didn't really expect or think were good. So what we did is we introduced something that the state has used, is a concept of averaging. And what it does is it just slows down that progression of the ebbs and flows that sites will feel from year to year as populations may increase or decrease. So what it does is it basically looks back over the last 3 years and it provides an average funding level based on those last prior years. So even if there is a drop in enrollment, it is basically mitigated and slowed down and it allows the school some time to plan for those changes.
And if it goes up, they're funded fully on
Right.
all their kids.
And-
So it's a catch on the bottom rather than having to have a slush fund somewhere to help people if their enrollment drops suddenly. It's the opposite. We give them all the money if they get all the kids, and then we help them out on an average basis. So they
Right.
don't have to be quite so cautious and so conservative.
Right. And it gives more predictability to the budget because there's not that concern of, did we miss our projection and is this district going to ask for money back when we do the October account?
So, and forgive me if you've answered this and I just didn't catch it. So, for example, here at Fossil, if the modular was added sooner, would that change the funding structure for the next year?
For the 15-16 year we're talking about?
Yes.
The coming year, those projections have been finalized
Okay.
and those staffing allocations have already been provided and submitted.
Okay, so no, is what I'm hearing from that.
Yes.
Well,
Okay.
that process typically takes place in January, February, March. It has to in order to do
Now
the
let me,
hiring cycle.
now let me follow up because I think there's, I maybe didn't complete that answer now. And Dr. Smyser had already mentioned this. If there's more kids in the October count, remember, the averaging does not put a floor, I mean, it just creates a floor. If there's more kids in the October count, then those kids are funded. If there's additional kids, we base it on
Oh,
the
I see.
October count. So if the October count yields a budget higher than the average number, we will provide that to the schools. That's typically how it's happened in the past when we do mid-year adjustments. There might be some mid-year adjustments that happen second semester.
And again, to be clear, those adjustments happening at a school level, district-wide, we're looking at maybe a little bit bigger picture in terms of trying to free up that or increase that capacity while also looking at long-term, how do we make more capacity in general? So now I'm going to go back to that route a little bit more.
Okay.
With this idea of the new middle school, high school, if the student population drops significantly here at Fossil, will that also impact funds and student-based budgeting numbers?
Yeah, potentially it can. That's why we're looking at the projections, and when we were just talking about the projected numbers, one of the things we're going to be paying attention to is the growth in the Fossil area. Will it pick up the students that are diverted to the new school? Now, right now, our numbers are projecting that that's not going to be an issue, but we will be paying attention to that. There are some sites that are probably more concerning that I think warrant more concern, specifically like Timnath and Bethkey. We're going to be paying attention, but we'd be paying attention to all the impacted sites and providing support if it's warranted to try to transition any short-term gap that would be needed until that growth comes in. But
Okay.
we're probably talking short-term 1 or 2 years.
So I'm going to stay on the theme of the new middle school, high school, and change a little bit of the perspective to talk about the athletic facility. So in addition to making sure that we have the facilities for athletics, will marching band be a priority for both the new school and in new facilities as we build those out?
We have not talked about that. I think in terms of field space, I don't know. I mean, actually, we don't know. We haven't talked about that. So we'll add that to our list of things to talk about.
Yeah,
looking at an educational specification as we design these new buildings, and that would be one thing that we would take into consideration is with the 612 school, what would that look like, and what would their needs be, and then what would that complex look like? So I think as we're working ahead now, we're still trying to develop that not only for the proposed elementary school, but also for what that 612 would look like out at the Prospect site, and also the 612 that would be proposed up in Wellington. There may be a little difference in size and scope.
Let's stay on the sports theme for a little bit. So are there plans included in this long-range facilities plan to upgrade French specific, or is the new sports complex going to be better than French Field, specifically the sound system, and will the existing sound system at French be upgraded as part of the plan?
That's a good question. I like that because the answer is we anticipate doing some press box renovations. That's one thing that's been identified at French. We have had some sound system questions at French. I've been around a long enough time to see several iterations of the sound there, so we keep working on that. And one thing with French, you know, a field is new once. We just redid that in 2012, and in part of the plan, we have to look at resurfacing these synthetic fields, much like, you know, Fossil Ridge is needing a resurfacing, and we're going to work to extend the life of that with some work this summer, but the plan is to replace that, add some other synthetic multi-play surfaces at Poudre and Fort Collins High, and then take a look at French and put that on a cycle that if it falls within that bond cycle, we're going to have to take a look. If it's 2012 and you get 10 years out of a field, these newer fields are becoming, their life cycle's extending a little bit more, and with the care we may be able to get some more time, but that's absolutely a consideration.
All right, one more question to round out our conversation around athletic fields. Can you speak to the consideration of other impacts outside of that to the schools directly, but we're looking at traffic and noise and light, and how do those elements play into building a new athletic facility?
Yeah, that's a question we've had before on the Prospect site with residents nearby, and yeah, we take a look at how that affects the impact from where we bring traffic in and out, where the light spillover, if you will. A lot of these facilities, the lights become very prescriptive now, and maybe we would propose a lighted field, where that would be set back from the building itself, how far back, as Dr. Smizer said, we have about 100 acres there, so we haven't master planned the site fully yet. So that's a consideration we would take with the neighborhoods, and we would take a look at you know, setbacks from the roads, how that traffic would flow, what that impact would be, and we would work with the local municipalities on that, as well as neighborhood concerns, and you know, work to come up with a balanced solution.
Okay, I'm going to switch topics again here. So thank you all for writing down your questions. It really does help me. And if I can't read them, I will call for help, which I just did. So I think this is related to boundaries, but is it possible that any property currently aligned with Preston or Fossil could be moved to another or new school? So is there sort of the possibility that the boundaries would change for both Preston and Fossil?
You want to do that one?
So with if the bond in 2016 were to pass and if we were to build the new high school, then boundaries would have to be modified. And we would build an entire new feeder system, and there's maps in the long-range plan, and there's one up on the front stage right now with proposed, you know, study areas or boundaries. So yes, with a new school would come a new boundary, and that would then take children from one school that currently has a boundary and place them in the new school. So yes, the answer is if you build a new school, it will have a new boundary. These will not be option schools, to the best of my knowledge.
Right, and it would, and we would anticipate it would scoop some kids from Preston and from Fossil, keeping in mind as few as possible who are already going to the other school. We would hope that we can phase kids in who haven't been to Preston or Fossil yet, and certainly those kids would go. And then sometimes, depending on how intense and fast the growth is, we may need to ask freshmen and sophomore to go there and let juniors and seniors, you know, we will have to make those decisions as we get closer and see how full the buildings are.
So if indeed it sounds like there is likely some impact there, how do we notify the property owners or the people within those boundaries? Do we notify them directly, or is that more of a community-based effort where it's in the newspaper or online or something along those lines? Do they get direct notification?
What have you done in the past?
It doesn't sound like it, no. The answer is no from the person that would know.
I'm
One
sorry,
of
go ahead.
the,
But we can,
This is Danielle Clark, our Director of Communications.
I'm Danielle, and I'm in charge of communications. We don't have the ability to, we don't have the email addresses of every resident on file in the Poudre School District. There's over 90,000 properties within our boundaries. So when we change boundaries, we notify our parents and those who've subscribed to our community email list. We don't have a means of notifying all of the property owners if they don't have a child in the system. So that would come most likely, I would imagine, through the election process or through the county assessor's office or something to that effect.
And then how far in advance are those boundary decisions, or how far in advance of the actual boundary decision are residents notified, right? So I know that there's a community engagement process around boundaries. How far in advance will people know of proposed changes before they're actually finalized?
if the changes are finalized by the time this plan would be finalized in March of next year, which is our hope, that they would be done well before then by the time, before any construction begins, people would know which boundary they're in, which would be, in some cases, 4 years out before a school would open,
Right.
depending on the school.
So who makes the final call on boundaries?
It's up to me to make the final recommendation to the board, and we haven't actually decided if it's a board decision or mine, so we'll wrestle that out amongst ourselves. But it lands in my lap. The committee is not, I think the most important thing to know is that the committee hopefully reaches a consensus, which they bring to me, but they are not the authority figures in the matter.
Okay. And then one more boundary question, and then we move on to potpourri, as I like to call it. But if the boundaries change and lines are drawn and plans are approved, if people are still not happy with that and want to sort of protest those changes, is there the ability to do so, and how would they do that?
Through the regular channels of emailing or coming in and having meetings, whatever it takes. I think that once they're finalized, though, it's more important to get involved now and to be aware and watch that boundary committee work, and we'll do our best to really advertise those boundaries before a final decision is made by myself and the board. So there should be plenty of time for people to be aware and watch them.
And just as a reminder, a third of the district already choices to a different school than their home boundary. So that's always an option. If you don't currently like it, about a third of the students already choice. So.
Well, since you brought up choice, let's move on. So can you tell us about the timeline around the issue of figuring out what to do with PrestonCanard? And again, who makes that decision as to how to address those two schools?
You guys want to talk about it?
Yeah, right now our next long-range meeting is set for next week. And as Dr. Smizer shared, is that we have a lot of issues still to come, and PrestonCanard are absolutely high on that list. And with our group, the assistant superintendents, work closely with the rest of that group to come up with some type of an answer. And I can't tell you that we have that right now. I know in the short term, we've talked about additional modulars, perhaps one at Canard, one at Preston, if you look at the timeline, to take some of that immediate growth. But we still need a bridge for a few more years that'll extend that anticipated growth. So we're still working on that and hope to have a better feel for that going into the fall.
So staying on Canard for a little bit, I think we saw in the presentation that one of the strategies to help I guess manage growth in that area is to sort of manage choice. In a 100% school, 100% choice school like Canard, how do we manage choice at that facility?
That's exactly the question. The main difference, though, is that the first priority, the number one priority, doesn't exist in Canard. So their list starts with number 2. So they follow the same policy. It's just number 1 is missing, which is the neighborhood kids have first priority. And then in our policy it goes to the number 2 group of kids and the number 3. Well, their list starts with number 2. So that's the basic idea, but after that it's all the same.
So I'm going to stay on the theme of choice here. So can you speak to the number of choice-in seats here at Fossil today? And how many seats is it estimated that that number will decrease in the next 3 years before we have the new facility online?
Currently, Fossil has about 17% choice, and that is dealt with, as far as how that will proceed. I know the assistant superintendents and the principals work closely together, and they work that out, trying their best to keep students who already started in a school and not kick them out and allow them to finish with, their cohort that is progressing through. And so you can see the choice numbers change through the grades. And I know they're working closely together. I know it's about 17%, but that is a drop from last year. So they are managing their choice, and I imagine they will closely watch and work with the principal to manage the choice as we continue and if the new school is built.
Okay, we have about 3 more minutes. If you have last-minute questions, get them up here, and I'll do my best to get them answered. Same for the folks watching at home. You can send an email to info@psdschools.org, but I'm going to quickly try and get us through these last ones. So will the district purchase new modulars for schools that are projected to receive them, or do we recycle old ones? And what do we do with them once we're done?
Haven't had that question. That's a good one. So the idea for going forth for next year, for the 16-17 school years, to go out with a request for proposal to purchase about 6 new modular units to be placed in the anticipated areas that the timeline shows. So we would look at putting those out there. A lot of the modulars that are on site stay. I think the modular is a little sometimes misleading because sometimes they stay a little longer, but the idea is, like at Zach, for example, if we build that addition, we want to move those modulars off of that site and relocate them. They may relocate to another location as yet unanticipated, and so we could use them in another place. And sometimes they just outlive their usefulness, and we just remove them from a site. But there's not many that we've done that to. We've repurposed them in other areas. For example, at Bethke, we're placing one there for the 15-16 school year, and we're moving an older modular from Timnath out to the Bethke site.
Great. So I'm going to shift us back to financing a little bit. I think a lot of us got our property evaluations or valuations recently and noticed an increase. So how does that property increase impact your budgets? And is there any way that some of those property tax increases can subsidize some of our planning here in the long-range facilities plan?
Great question.
That is a great question, and I'm going to try to be as brief as I can, but that's probably worthy of a fairly lengthy conversation. So there was an increase in assessed valuation that we're seeing, and right now we're thinking that's definitely in the double digits. I've heard some reports of 15-16%, and I know the newspaper's been doing articles on those also. The challenge is that property tax, so I think the best way to approach this question, I'm going to need to take a little time, is to talk about how funding works just in general. So Dr. Smizer had mentioned earlier that we have what we call total program funding, and that's our per pupil funding that we receive from the state. It's a state formula. And every district is treated the same way in Colorado, all 178 districts. They all start out with a base unit, similar to our own model internal. And then there's adjustments to differentiate between districts. So that's how the state funding works. And within that funding is a component of property tax, okay? And that property tax, the mill levy that is associated with that property tax, is established in state statute. And currently, Poudre School Districts is 27 mills. So what that means is when assessed valuation goes up, then there's additional property tax that comes in the district. But remember, total program is made up of multiple components of revenue. So property tax is one. Vehicle registrations is a very small one. That's another local. The other biggest piece is state funding. And so what property tax doesn't yield to a school district, the state is required to do what they call backfilling, and the state makes up the difference. Right now, statewide, the state is picking up about 60% of the cost, and 40% is covered by property tax. So yes, that property tax valuation will help. The question is who is it going to help? Because typically, and this is the big question, and in school finance this year under Senate Bill 15267, which is a school finance bill, the legislators actually made a declaration around this increased assessed valuation saying if the assessed valuation does hold true, and we won't know till November till it's finalized, but if it holds true, the legislators made a declaration that they want that money to go to K-12 and not reduce the state's contribution to help with funding. So if you follow what I just said, typically what happens is if property taxes go up, the state funding goes down. And you end up back where you were for our total program funding, okay? Again, I could talk about this probably at length. Now, the other piece that really rolls into that question is mill levy overrides. When we go out to the voters for overrides, what we do is we talk, and this is how typically they work, is you go out and say, like for the recent example, in 2010, we had an override of $16 million. Assessed valuation can go up, but we still can't collect more than $16 million. So our actual mill levy has to drop down so that we're only collecting and spending the $16 million that we told the voters that they could. So it's really independent of what happens with assessed valuation. The piece that's felt is the property tax that's needed to support that activity. So that's one piece. Now, where it can help, and the biggest last piece is in the bond area. And so when we issue bonds, so I talked about the two major sources of revenue. The other piece is bonds, and bonds are simply how we do capital construction in Colorado. Think about it as a mortgage. So, you know, when you go out and get a mortgage, you go out and get a loan. There's cash provided to buy the house, and then your obligation is you pay the principal and interest on that mortgage. So bonds work very similar. They're quite a bit more complicated, but it's a very similar concept where the district would issue bonds, receive the cash from investors, and then our obligation is to pay back the principal and interest over time for the cash that we use to do the buildings. That assessed valuation coming in, we will be able to manage our debt portfolio to the extent where it will help mitigate potential property tax increases that may be associated with the new bond. So some of that property tax valuation can help pay for some of the bond if approved by the voters.
I'm going to make a gross over simplification here. So when we're looking at property taxes and we say who decides where that goes as it relates to the district, it's truly the voters because of mill levy overrides or what they voted for you to spend, and the state legislature based on their policy.
I think that hits the nail on the head to the
Okay.
question. It's who controls and who has the ability to use those numbers, and really the total program is defined by statute. Everything else is dependent by the voters.
Thank you for sticking with me. I know we're a little bit over, but I'm going to get through my one last question and then I'll get you guys out of here. So we're going to go back to choice. We're changing topics again. But can you tell us, is the district adamant about keeping siblings at the same school as they keep kids? You know, tell us about that. So where does the sibling consideration fall in the school of choice policy? Because it sounds like there's some kids and families here that are split at Fossil, and that's always hard on families, as we know.
It is the third priority on the choice policy. So you can go get that on the long-range planning website and take a look at how principals have to look at this group gets to come in first, then this group, and it's the third group. So in cases where it's extremely crowded with neighborhood schools, you could get to such severe crowding that you could not get a sibling of a choiced kid in. You're already in there. But you're never going to get a sibling of a neighborhood, because they would be a neighborhood student. So siblings of neighborhood kids, we would always make room, even if we have to add modulars while we're waiting for new buildings. But siblings is number 3. Well, it's just a matter of how many seats do we have available for choice. So that severe to me means none or almost none.
Okay, I'm going to let us get out of here. If you do have more questions, I know the panel has in the past stuck around for a little bit. You can have additional questions, write them down. We'll make sure to answer them online. Again, we will post all of the questions and all of the answers online to psdschools.org within 48 hours of right now. Before we head out, Dr. Smizer, anything else you want to say?
just thanks for coming. Thanks for engaging with us around this topic. Please don't be shy. We really are watching that website and picking up these emails and adding the questions and answers onto the website.
So wonderful. Again, psdschools.org or email info@psdschools.org. And with that, I will let us go. Thank you all very much for being here today.